So let's continue with video number 3. We're going to talk about, this is chapter 2 or 16, depending on which version you have, how I bring in factory overhead. So factory overhead includes all other costs except direct materials and direct labor. So this means any indirect materials. Indirect materials we talked about in the previous chapter. These are things that are insignificant cost and are hard to actually measure. Any indirect labor, these are supervisors and salaries for people who do not work directly on the product. Also any utility bills, also depreciation. So my next journal entry is to load the factory overhead account. So first I have to load the factory overhead account with the amounts, then I'm going to put it into WIP. So here we incurred $4,600, and here's how it's broken down. It's materials, these are actually indirect materials, but I still have to pull them out of the materials ledger account. Here's my indirect labor, here's my utilities, here's my depreciation. So now that I've actually got $4,600 that I put into factory overhead, we need to talk about how do I allocate to these jobs my factory overhead. And this is the most important part right here coming up. We need to know how do we allocate factory overhead. And so there's a couple different ways, and we're going to learn something called cost allocation. And in order to do that, I need to understand something called an activity base. An activity base or an activity driver is something that actually will help drive the production of the things. Here are the most common ones: direct labor hours, direct labor cost, or machine hours. Honestly, guys, number 1 is the most popular. Number 3 is the next popular. Number 2 being the least popular. So, knowing that I have an activity base, we're going to do what we call, we're basically going to make a guess on how to allocate. And we do this by using something called predetermined factory overhead rate. Predetermined is nothing more than a guess to the best of your ability. It's called also, we're going to apply it. So the formula is estimated total factory overhead cost divided by the estimated activity base. So remember, if that direct labor hours is my activity base, then that's how we're going to allocate it. So here's the formula you need to write down, you need to know. Here's how we're going to use it. So my Legend Guitars, I estimate, this is a guess, that my factory overhead costs are going to be $50,000 this year, and the activity base is 10,000 direct labor hours. So given this, I'm going to use a $5 per direct labor hour rate for these jobs. Now I will know the actual labor hours because I have direct labor hours being brought in. But $5 per each is how I'm going to do it. And so once we do this predetermined, remember this is strictly a guess before it's happened. Okay, so now so we're going to basically do something called activity-based costing. And we'll talk about that in another chapter. Let's move on. So here are my time cards. Remember my time cards? We knew how many hours job 71 was going to do. That was 350 times my $5. So that means I'm going to bring in $1,750 for this job for factory overhead. Here it was 500 hours times the 5. So I'm going to bring in $2,500. And so my factory overhead total is going to be $4,250. And this is what we call applying factory overhead to work in process. Okay, this is a little bit complicated concept. Just wanted to let you guys know. Let me move me over a little bit. So our next journal entry will be applying factory overhead. Now the first journal entry in factory overhead was to load the factory overhead account up with the cost. Now we're going to be applying it. So here's my journal entry. Take it out of factory overhead by crediting it and putting it into WIP by debiting it. Now remember, this is just a guess, and I really won't know what it actually is until I finish. So this is another journal entry. This is applying factory overhead. Okay, so here, this is very, very important. On the next few slides, I want you to make sure you write it down. and I'm going to go over my little 5-minute time limit on this. If my factory overhead account is debited, then I'm increasing my actual overhead cost. So when I debit my factory overhead, after I've applied it, we'll talk about that in a minute, it means that I had more cost than I thought. If I end up crediting it, it means that I had less than I applied. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to determine, is my actual more or less than what I actually applied? Very important to know. And here's, so write this stuff down right here. These are quiz questions and exam questions, okay? So depending on whether the actual is larger or smaller, it'll tell me by what type of balance I have left. Okay? If the applied overhead is less than the actual, in other words, I applied $4,250, but my actual was $4,500, then I'll end up with a debit balance. That's called under applied. If the applied is more, in other words, the guess was more than I expected it to be, it's going to have, I'm sorry, this is wrong. One of them should say credit here. Okay, this should say credit. I'm sorry, it's a mistake. And I'll fix that. Over applied. Okay, so here is the journal. Here's what it's looking at. So I actually had a $200 balance in there, and then I applied $4,600. So I had a credit balance. That credit balance was over applied because I told you on the previous slide. So then I brought in $4,600. So now I have $4,400 because I'm subtracting it. This is debit minus the credit. Then I applied, here's my $4,250 that I applied, and now I have a debit balance. So right now it's under applied. This is the hardest part of this chapter. Make sure you get this. This concludes this part of the video, and we'll move on in the next video.